Welcome, Patreon subscribers. For those of you who are Patreon subscribers, we have several different tiers of subscribers here today at this particular session. For those of you who are at the $10 a month level, that includes the Cosmic Quickies. I'm doing a few extra of these events because the Cosmic Quickies have been a little more scant than I would have preferred. I do have a couple in process right now, but it seems like the production time on all of these take a little bit more than I would like. So welcome to our Patreon subscribers and supporters. We have the people here who are at the planetary level, galactic level, and the apprentices at the cosmic level. We also have an additional group that are from Astrology Hub, and astrologyhub.com is a wonderful site, a community effort that has a group of astrologers who are teaching and leading workshops and seminars there. And if you want more information on Astrology Hub, go to astrologyhub.com. And so welcome to all of you. So we have an agenda in front of us. I'm going to jump in and kind of stay as focused as I can. This talk that you're about to hear has been around in a few incarnations now. And I became interested, like many people, of the significance of the Saturn-Pluto cycles by actually watching them unfold. And the most recent event that got my attention and everyone else's attention who looks at this, it probably came into our awareness around the time of the World Trade Tower bombing. And the reason for that is that on September 11th, 2001, we had an event that really shook the consciousness of people all over the planet, because in some ways it was akin to Rome being invaded by the Visigoths. After 1,100 years of no foreign power ever coming into Rome, all of a sudden there was an invasion and Rome basically fell, or it began to fall over the years ahead. And in a way, for the United States, who has been, as a country, a player on the world stage ever since its beginning, or at least in the last century, the fact is that we in the United States have had a rather isolated, sovereign view of the world, where we were a participant in world events, and yet the idea of a war or an attack to our country, since England attacked in the War of 1812, the second war of the United States against England, almost 200 years ago, actually more than 200 years ago, there had never been an attack on the United States. And this actually occurred when Saturn was opposing Pluto. Before I jump into the meat of all of this, I do want to make a couple of statements here at the beginning about my research methodology and also about outer planet cycles in general. First of all, when I'm working with the events attached to slow-moving outer planetary cycles, and here I refer to cycles of Saturn to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and Uranus to Neptune and Pluto, and Neptune to Pluto. So the Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto cycles, and the most frequent, the highest frequency of this cycle, are the Saturn conjunctions and oppositions, because of those planets Saturn moves the fastest. And it turns out that Saturn lines up with Pluto about every 35 years. It varies because Pluto is such an elliptical orbit that Pluto can actually move very fast or very slow. And when Pluto moves very fast, it takes longer for Saturn to go around and catch back up to it when Pluto is moving slower. The Saturn-Pluto conjunctions are closer together. So normally, though, the Saturn-Pluto cycle occurs, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurs about every 33, 35 years. It can be less, it can be more. The last conjunction that occurred was in 1982. That would be that right now we're pushing here at 2020, we're pushing 38 years between now and the previous conjunction in 1982. When I do outer planet cycles like this, I use what astrologers have come to call Tarnassian aspects. Rick Tarnas, we'll talk about more later, has written an encyclopedic book called Cosmos and Psyche, in which he looks at the historical rhythms of the outer planets. And Rick uses what many astrologers would consider very wide aspects, but for historical purposes, these wide aspects really seem to catch the grasp of the events that occur. I sometimes think that the reason why is that there's this thing called the lag of seasons, and the lag of seasons is why it's not the hottest day of the year on the day of the longest amount of sunlight. In other words, on June 21st, which is the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, that's not the hottest day of the year. The hottest day of the year doesn't occur for another month or so, because it takes time for the waters of the earth to heat up and cool off, and therefore there's a lag in the actual event of the actual transit of the earth to the sun's of the earth and the sun in its relationship to its plane and its declination, because the coldest day of the year is not the day when the sun is at its lowest declination. Again, here I'm talking from the northern hemispheric point of view. What that means is that we have major astrological outer planet cycles like the Uranus-Pluto conjunction cycle. The last Uranus-Pluto conjunction occurred in the mid-60s. Actually, it occurred a few times from the summer of 1966 to the summer, from the summer of 1965 to the summer of 1966. But when we look at the events of what we call the 60s in relationship to the conjunction of the revolutionary sudden change planet, shock planet of Uranus, the planet of awakening, as it lined up with Pluto, the planet of deep, powerful, metamorphic change. The big events, there were things cooking in 65 and 66, but there were major ramifications of this conjunction through 67, 68. I mean, people want to know what happened in the 60s. It really came to a culmination in 67, 68, 69, even 1970, even 1971. By 72, it began to wane. So by the same token, when I'm looking at the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions and oppositions, there's a sense of a wide net that we are already in the midst of. We had the chart of now up a few minutes ago, and the Saturn-Pluto conjunction right now is at about 5 degrees. There it is right there. Saturn is at 16 and Pluto is at 21. Now they came within a couple of degrees, but then during the retrograde phase, that's widening, and that then will come back into exactitude, into perfection next January. And for months, I've been saying the most important event, the most important astrological event of 2019 is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in January of 2020. And so we have to give these wide berths, and the fact of the matter is we are already currently right now in range of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And when we look at this period from a historical point of view, the events that are occurring right now will be part of the wider Saturn-Pluto conjunction that's not exact until until January 12th of 2020. And those events will still be building and will be feeling probably all the way through 2020 on into 2021. But that's a separate topic from today. So what I did in the work that we will be looking at today is I went back to, about 2,300 years ago, and I had my astrology calculation program calculate the exact conjunctions and oppositions of Saturn and Pluto over the course of some 2,300 years. I then took the dates of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and I made a spreadsheet that had the year of and the year before and the year after each of these conjunctions and oppositions. And that was the active net that I used. Let me explain just a moment more about that before I go on. So right now, for example, we have the Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurring in 2020. By the use of my system, I would have 2019, 2020, and 2021 in the net of looking for events that corresponded with that, with the upcoming conjunction. The last opposition occurred in the summer of 2001. And even though the World Trade Tower bombing was a bit after the conjunction, I'm sorry, a bit after the opposition, it was still within range of that opposition, because actually events of 2000, 2001, and 2002 would have fallen in this, would have been caught by my net here. Now, what that means is that if the Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurs well, for right now, every 38 years, but let's just say about every 35 years, that's a pretty good, or 33 years, 35 years. If one were to say that, then out of those let's say 35 years, one would have 3 years of Saturn-Pluto activity around the conjunction and 3 years around the opposition, which would mean that in every 35-year period, there would be about 6 years that I would catch in my Saturn-Pluto net, and about 29 years that would fall through the cracks. And the question becomes, why is it that when we take the most important remembered events throughout the history of humankind, that they seem to cluster, the events seem to cluster around these 3-year periods of Saturn-Pluto conjoining and opposing, the World Trade Tower bombing certainly being one of them. Incidentally, that September 11th, 2001 chart is a chart that a lot of people know very well. It actually has Saturn on the day at the moment of the bombing forming a close trine with Mercury that was rising in New York at the time of the bombing. But what's interesting here is that this is a good chart to show us that trines are not necessarily good and squares necessarily bad. And it's good and bad are judgments that occur from particular point of views. It turns out that the Saturn Mercury trine, which should be solid, good communication, it was solid and good communication for those people who were trying to communicate something at that moment. It wasn't necessarily good from the standpoint of those who were receiving the message, whether the message was valid or not, or whether they liked the message or not. The fact is that this Saturn-Mercury trine certainly came through. The fact that Mercury was at the point where it was releasing the energy from the tension built up by Saturn pulling one way in Gemini, Pluto pulling the other in Sagittarius. And of course, at the time of this bombing, we also were at the time when the sun was forming a square with both Saturn and Pluto. But I do like to take a look at this chart from a slightly different point of view before we go on. The purpose of today is not to look at this chart. It's to get a wide scan of all of the of all of the events. Rita asked, what is the orb I consider? The orb I use is not, at least for historical events of the slow-moving planets, is not based upon degrees of the orb, it's based upon the time. So in other words, on the Saturn Pluto, I would give it about a year before and a year after. But in the slower moving outer planet cycles, like the Uranus Pluto conjunction, or the Uranus of 1965-66, or the Uranus Pluto square that occurred from 2012 to 2015, I would give these close to 5 years on either side, a decade, 10 or 12 years, because again, we're not talking about an individual, we're talking about the ripples flowing through society and there being this lag. So I don't use degree orbs, I use time orbs when it comes to these events. Now, in looking at the World Trade Tower bombing, though, it's very significant to, or let me put it this way, we miss a huge amount of the intensity of what was going on here unless we look at the chart and take a look at the septiles. Now, I don't want to dig deeply into the septiles right now, but those of you who study with me on a regular basis know that I am a strong proponent of quintiles and septiles, that they are arbitrarily excluded or made less than because they don't fit into the 12-fold nature of the zodiac. And I always impress upon my students that there are not 12 signs up there in the heavens, there are 12 signs here in our minds. And that to arbitrarily say that a division of the circle by 5 or by 7 doesn't work because it doesn't fall into the division by 12 is totally an arbitrary perspective that emphasizes the three-dimensional reality based upon squares and trines. And I don't want to dig deeper into this right now. I just want to point out that for those of you who know my work with quintiles and septiles, you know that they are both metaphysical aspects. They don't necessarily create an event in the real world unless there is something to propel it into the real world here, like a sun square Saturn, for example, or this Mercury trine Saturn, Mercury rising, which is a bit of almost like it's almost like a little bit of grease that allows this event to come through. But that septiles are totally otherworldly. You know, I always look at septile charts through the eyes of the charts of like Michael Jackson or David Bowie or I mean, these are Edgar Allan Poe. These are people who are otherworldly, supernatural. They have connections to not here, not now. Dane Rudhyar called the septile the angle of fate. And I think it's not, well, fate is a symptom, but it's more that things come screaming through or blasting through from the other side. And when we look at the same chart that we're looking at now, the World Trade Tower bombing, we actually can see the purple lines here are septiles. The short ones are exact, you know, those are the 1/7 of a circle, septiles, the moon to Venus. The biseptiles are like Mars to the sun. And the triseptiles, that's 3/7 of a circle. And here, if you could imagine a 7-pointed star, you have Mars, Uranus, and the sun, each on one point of a 7-pointed star. And to have this amount of septile, that's seven, you know, a 7th harmonic, to have this amount of septile activity in a chart is overwhelming, and it's very indicative of something crashing through from the other side. Now, without getting hung up here on the World Trade Tower bombing, because that event has such an intense and visceral feeling, especially for those in the United States, especially for those who are who lived in or around New York. But I want to bring the focus back here just for a moment to January 11th, January 12th, depending on where you are on the planet, 2020, where we will have Saturn and Pluto aligned at 22 degrees of Capricorn, but Mercury and the Sun will be only a degree away, which means that over the next day, Mercury will conjunct Saturn and Pluto, as will the Sun. Jupiter, which is in Capricorn, will take a bit more time, and it will come through those points later in the year. But what I want to do is, before I move into the into the actual dates of events, I just want to share with you a quick a short poem that I wrote many years ago, because this kind of sums up where we are right now in the history of things, and it's called River Ride. It's time to situate your situations. It's time to understand what's going down, down, down. For he who moves too slowly will simply perish in the night, but he who rides the river will not drown. Yes, it's time to formalize what goes on behind your eyes. It's time to understand what's going down, down, down. For he who moves too slowly will soon fall far behind, and the tidal currents wait to pull you down, down, down. The tidal currents wait to pull you down. It's time to move along, and it's time to sing new songs. It's time for us to hear what wise men say. For he who crosses bridges that are still dark at night will always need a light to guide the way. We always need a light to guide the way. And it's my sense that astrology can be a light to help us guide our way. Astrology is a system that enables us to make invisible cycles visible. And by learning about these cycles and these patterns, we can then increase our choices. It increases the potential choices that we get to make, because the patterns are not invisible. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about Saturn and a few minutes talking about Pluto before we talk about the actual events themselves. We think of Saturn as the planet of testing, the planet of tribulations. The wonderful book about the greatness of Saturn is a brilliant, it's a Vedic, a story that comes from the Vedic tradition. But basically, Saturn is the planet that you don't mess with. You know, Saturn brings woe, at least historically, and yet Saturn really has an important job. Saturn's job is the gatekeeper of the three-dimensional reality. Saturn is the planet of limits and boundaries. One of my recent lecture topics that I've been focusing on, and maybe I'll do a talk here on Patreon about this, is about how Saturn's function as the gatekeeper between physical and metaphysical realities has disintegrated a bit in the past 100 years, 50 years, even 10, 15 years, where the boundary between here and there, the boundary between the visible and the invisible, is not quite as impenetrable as it once was. Now, Saturn has something that is associated with the squares, the square aspects and the nodes. And that is because each of these three things, although they seem very different, you know, one's a planet, one's a mathematical point, the nodes, and the other is an aspect, they're all about how reality manifests. It's about the appearance of those things that are real. And of course, we must question what is real. But the fact of the matter is that Saturn precipitates real events in a chart by transit, as do, when I say squares, I really mean conjunction squares and oppositions, because they're all fourth harmonic. And the nodes are the place where the orbit of the moon around the earth and the orbit of the earth around the sun intersect. And they also have to do with the illusion of the three-dimensional reality as being the only thing that's real. And that's another whole topic to dig into. We're not going there right now. For right now, I simply want to focus for a minute on the imagery of Saturn itself, and the fact that Saturn is actually the symbol of Saturn, which predates the Aramaic Greco-Roman alphabets. The symbol of Saturn actually is made up of two discrete symbols. One is the cross, and the cross, which we know of as the symbol of Christianity, is actually the cross of the material universe. And it, in fact, is a symbol that has to do with structure and squares, because when two things intersect at 90 degrees, which is what the two lines of the cross do, things get bent out of shape. And when things get bent out of shape, they want to pull in and make themselves real. Think of the biggest events in your life, and something happens and you react to it, or you take a position, you hold a position, and the cross of the material universe, the cardinal points upon which we hang everything else, the north, south, east, west points, or the ascendant, descendant, MC, and IC. These are basically the points that do not move. This is the stability, the stable points of the cosmos that make things seem real. And then we have this that gets hung onto that cross, the cross of materiality. And this, which looks like a backwards letter S, really represents the ever-changing rising and falling of the tides. It represents the moon. It's the sine wave. And in fact, this symbol represents all cycles of change. But the important thing is that when things change, they are always still nailed to the cross. This is why Saturn is so significant, because things change and yet something doesn't change. The structure stays the same. Now, this symbol of Saturn, actually, if you flip it around and just create a mirror image, you come up with what looks like the letter ST. And this is something that's really, really strange. I remember many years ago, 1990, close to 30 years ago, when I was kind of fiddling my way into this material, I ran this by Rob Hand, which I always use as a gauge as to whether I'm onto something that's important or not. And as I talked to Rob about this idea of the symbol of Saturn being a backwards ST, and the sound ST in English and in the Romantic languages in general are all Saturnine words. He said, "My God, Levine, I think you've stumbled upon a theory of natural evolution of language." Now, those are Rob's Mercury and Sagittarius, big words to describe what I think I stumbled on. But the fact of the matter is, here's the meat of this. I've probably spent more time than should be admitted, turning pages in the Oxford English Dictionary and the OED and in other dictionaries to realize how many words with an ST in it are Saturnine words. I mean, crystallization, construction, constriction, astringence, existence, systems, austerity, stop, start, things that have limits are all Saturnian words. So the stuff is all about giving order, but it's also about creating limits. In order to put things in order, we give things structure by making a list. In a list, we put things in order and we make the boundaries of first and last. In fact, the boundaries of our living in the world we are limited by statutes of state. We find our places in the real world by our postal street address. In fact, every action is delimited by a start and a stop. So this whole thing of Saturn is interesting because Saturn is the real world, and in the English language, we have a part of speech we call a noun, and we use adjectives to describe things or to describe nouns. But you see, Saturn always defines the limit. You can't go any further out than Saturn until the telescope or until technology was used. without going out to that which doesn't move. Saturn was the limit of life, the limit of movement to the ancients. So we describe something, and then we establish its limit by putting Saturn at the end of it. Big, bigger, biggest. Hot, hotter, hottest. The st becomes the limit. Happiest, most, smallest, bigger, biggest, small, smallest, most. The ST becomes the absolute limit that we cannot go beyond. And in fact, Saturn and Satan are the same word. That the ST of Saturn doesn't judge good or bad. It just says that when Lucifer, the fallen angel, came through the gates of Saturn, he became manifest, he became real. Now, I want to move this along a little bit faster. Rob Hand wrote in Horoscope Symbols, the universe resists the individual reaching out. At some point, the universe says, no, you cannot come any further. This is the energy of Saturn. It's the energy that maintains reality as we understand it. It makes the rule, sets the limit, creates the structure, and defines the nature of the game. But the problem with Saturn, the truly serious problem of Saturn, lies in the idea of reality itself. Namely, the equation of reality with truth. Reality seems immutable, orderly, and eternal, yet life is so short we cannot see whether or not at some fundamental level the rules of the game themselves are changing. But they may be. What we think with our limited perspective, what we think is reality is not necessarily truth. So we have Saturn as the gatekeeper of reality. It's the limits, it's the boundaries. It's the boundaries of an idea, of a country, of a state, of a person. Now, we're going to jump to Pluto, because Pluto is the phoenix. It's the magical bird that arises from the ashes of the ruins of destruction. Operative words here are ashes, ruins, and destruction. I might mention parenthetically that on Easter weekend, Easter Sunday weekend in 2001, in March, Rob Hand sat down to write an article for the Mountain Astrologer on the Saturn-Pluto, the upcoming Saturn-Pluto cycle. And although he didn't predict in words the bombing of the World Trade Tower, the actual article itself, which was published midsummer, I think maybe June, July, the article that Rob wrote back in March of that year had the title across 3 columns in the Mountain Astrologer. And on the farthest left column, there was a single artist's rendition of a very tall glassine building, office building, with the middle on fire with the phoenix, the shield of the phoenix, coming directly out of the fire. Now, it's crazy because that picture, which appeared in print a couple of months before the actual World Trade Tower bombing, was in itself what's the right word? A prophetic moment where something that happened was actually shown in print prior to it happening. But the phoenix requires heat and destruction and death, because it's the heat that actually activates the egg. You know, like there are many pine trees that require a fire. They require the pine cone to burn in order to activate the seeds for the new growth to occur. And this is Pluto, but Pluto is also slow moving in process. It's metamorphosis. And you know, from the outside, the fascination that as kids we have of this weird, ugly little caterpillar kind of coming out, this magical butterfly, we think, wow, nature is so cool, it's so magical. But if we ever stop to think about what this is like from the caterpillar's point of view, caterpillar gotta go. It's the end of the caterpillar. The caterpillar has to go through a death and rebirth in order for the metamorphosis to take place. In fact, I saw a cartoon once of two caterpillars standing at the base of the milkweed plant, and a butterfly is going by, and one caterpillar says to the other, he goes, "Man, you'd never get me up in one of those contraptions." The fact is that in plutonic metamorphoses, there's no way that to see what will happen on the far end based upon a trajectory. With Saturn, if you have 3 or 4 points on a Saturn trajectory, for example, a client comes in and they have their, their moon at 28 degrees of Capricorn. And you can look back in their life and you can look at what happened every time Saturn either squared or opposed or squared or conjoined or squared or opposed, going all the way back to their birth. And you can map this out, the 7-year cycle of conjunctions and squares and oppositions. And you can almost make a trajectory as to what the course of least resistance will be, because Saturn follows a cause and effect trajectory. Pluto, on the other hand, does not. There's no way you can look at a caterpillar and figure out that it will become a butterfly. And so when we have Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, we have the intertwining of this very causal relationship of Saturn, but tied to this very slow-moving, overwhelming metamorphosis of Pluto. You see, Pluto is glacial in as much as Pluto can take centuries to take down a mountain and a forest, whereas an earthquake can do a lot of damage in just a few moments. Which packs more power? Well, the earthquake can certainly be incredibly destructive, but Pluto, meaning the slow-moving glacier, can actually remove a mountain. It can take down an entire, the stability that goes beyond Saturn. And there's no way to predict what will happen at the far end, because Pluto, as metamorphosis, is a complete one-way change that only occurs once. It's not like the Saturnian leaves falling off the trees every year at the same time and then growing back. That is a regular change cycle. Pluto is a one-way street. It's a metamorphosis. Now, as much as I loved Jeff Green's book, I like to point out that James Hillman, the torchbearer of Jungian psychology, James Hillman wrote a book called The Dream and the Underworld. I think that this book is the best book on Pluto I've ever read. There's no astrology in the book. It's not a how to analyze Pluto cycles. It's just really reframing the relationship between Pluto and the unconscious and that which doesn't exist here in the three-dimensional world, and the fear and the negativity that we have built up around Pluto. William Blake wrote in his first prophetic book, a work called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Blake wrote, "Hell is a place so beautiful that it would torment an angel to insanity." You see, the hell realms are only negative because they got a negative rap from the Judeo-Christian tradition. If we're born of original sin, then how can it be good at the end? We're going to go someplace and get punished. But the fact of the matter is that Liz Green wrote that Pluto is Saturn's only friend, because it used to be that Saturn was the end. Saturn was the end. But now we know that Saturn is just the beginning of the metamorphosis that occurs once consciousness has been released from the three-dimensional reality. So this connection between Saturn and Pluto is so significant because it, for a moment, links that which is here and now, the limits of change, and that which has no limits, that goes beyond the three-dimensional world. As planetary cycles affect the affairs of individuals, so too do they inform cultural affairs, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the evolution of ideas and technology. This idea is one that many modern astrologers share. It's the subject of Rick Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New World View. In it, Rick Tarnas writes of the Saturn-Pluto cycle. He writes, these Saturn-Pluto events denote, quote, especially challenging historical periods marked by a pervasive quality of intense contraction, that would be Saturn, contraction Saturn, eras of international crisis and conflict, empowerment of reactionary forces and totalitarian impulses, that would be Pluto, organized violence and oppression, all sometimes marked by lasting traumatic effects. I have the word traumatic in there twice, sorry. So, the cycle of Saturn and Pluto creates a rhythm of boundary creation and then boundary destruction, and then the adjustment to these new boundaries, adapting to them, and then the creation of new boundaries, and then the destruction of those boundaries, and then the adjustment to them, and so on and so on and so on, because Saturn conjoins Pluto 3 times every century. I like to think of it as Waltz Time for civilization. It's over 100 years. It's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Every 100 years, there's 3 beats on the Saturn-Pluto clock. And if you added the half beats in between the oppositions, you'd get 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1. It's still a waltz, however slow or fast it goes. And it's, as I've observed this, we look at some of the most significant events over time, and many of them that we look at will be negative with positive outcomes. But geez, isn't that how Saturn often works? You look back at a point in your life and you go, yeah, it really sucked when it was happening, but boy, am I glad I went through that, because now blah, 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 fill in the blank. So let's take a look at some Saturn-Pluto events and see if we can put all this together. First of all, I want to put the bombing of the World Trade Tower into perspective, because on that day, about 2,500 people lost their lives, which is, I mean, and there was great loss of property. However, I want to bounce back to the Saturn-Pluto opposition in 532 AD. Now, for the record, the events that I'm looking at here all occur within a year of the exact opposition or conjunction. The charts that I have are the actual exact oppositions or conjunctions themselves. In my research, as I've went back through our history and looked at events that happened the year of, the year before, the year after these Saturn-Pluto conjunctions and oppositions, I am unable to discern a difference between the events at the conjunction and the opposition. Unlike natal astrology, hold on a second. Unlike natal astrology, where a conjunction and an opposition really work very differently, because a conjunction is an internal process and an opposition usually occurs through projection or through relationship, through something environmentally on the outside. My analysis of the events that occur on Saturn-Pluto conjunctions and oppositions are roughly the same. And I will, from this point forward, just refer to them as a Saturn-Pluto event. It's like a lunation can be a new moon or a full moon. And so here, a Saturn-Pluto event can be a Saturn-Pluto conjunction or opposition. In 532, Emperor Justinian was trying to put down a tax revolt and to show people that he was serious and that they shouldn't go against his power. The imperial troops in Constantinople, now Istanbul, of which I had the pleasure of lecturing in and visiting this year. In Istanbul, in Constantinople, the imperial army of Justinian came into a major sporting event in an arena and locked the gates of it and killed 25,000 people. 25,000 people were killed. And this wasn't by bomb or by poison gas. It was by direct knife or bludgeoning that the army basically just came in and one at a time killed 25,000 people, basically to let people know they shouldn't fuck with him, that Emperor Justinian was serious, and go home and be quiet. I mean, the ones that were killed obviously couldn't go home, but but this was a serious event, and it occurred on a Saturn and Pluto opposition, and there was also Mars at the release point of that opposition, and it certainly was a violent event. And yes, it was it was almost on the Capricorn Cancer aspect, Janelle. It was actually at the very last degree of Gemini and Sagittarius, but it was reinforced by the fact that there was an opposition also between Venus and Jupiter. In 629, there was another Saturn-Pluto event, and in 629, Mohammed, with an army, walked into Mecca, declared it the state of Islam. Not a shot was fired. There was no act of war other than it was a declaration. And what's interesting, as compared with the Justinian revolt, where Mars was at the release point. Incidentally, this is sometimes referred to as the point of Thales, or Thales, who is a Greek philosopher. And whenever you have an opposition, we know that a point that's square to both of the points on the opposition, that makes a T-square. But if you have a point that is sextile one side of the tug of war, the Saturn, and trine the other side, here it's Pluto, that planet becomes an important planet because it releases the tension. It releases the energy. And this works either by transit and or in natal charts and in synastry. It's a very powerful point. But here at this moment, where it was not a violent moment, there was a very important turning point in the history of Western culture. Now, one of the things that's very weird about these Saturn-Pluto points is they show something. I may have a slide on this later on. I don't remember. We all know what synchronicity is. That's two things that happen at the same point at the same time. Jung called it meaningful coincidence. Wolfgang Pauli, who won a Nobel Prize for what's called the Pauli exclusion principle, which says that two subatomic particles cannot occupy the same place at the same time. Wolfgang Pauli actually was the founding thinker behind what became Jung's work in synchronicity. But there's another word that Rick Tarnas uses in Cosmos and Psyche, and that word is diachronicity. If synchronicity are two things, chronos, that happen at the same chronos time, syn the same, dia, across chronos time, are two things that happen disconnected in time, but are still connected by coincidence, even though they are dia across time, not at the same moment of time. Now, we had Muhammad declaring Mecca the state of Islam on a Saturn-Pluto event in 629. Almost 100 years later, we had the Berbers, the Moors, actually in an incursion of about 10,000 troops into Spain and putting a foothold in the Iberian Peninsula that basically is called the Moorish invasion of Spain. And from about 700 through around 1200, Spain was basically under the Muslim domination, and that occurred, the actual invasion itself, in 711, but it was within that year window of a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, this one in Cancer. And boy, look at that cluster of planets there within 30 degrees of the zodiac. And interestingly enough, here it's the Saturn-Pluto point that becomes, and really it's the sun, but it's this whole cluster, Sun, Mercury, Chiron, that becomes that release point. And at that same time, there was a Uranus-Neptune opposition occurring, which basically ups the level of intensity of that particular event. But it was still a Saturn-Pluto event. Now, here's where it gets weird, because you have Islam becoming a formal, a formalized nation-state religion, nationalistic religion, on a Saturn-Pluto event. You have Spain falling to the Muslims, or becoming Muslim, whether it was a fall or not. But certainly the Christians lost to the Muslims was the actual conflict that never really stopped. But it wasn't until more than 500 years later, in the 13th century, that we began to realize that the Christians reconquered most of Spain. This was a very dynamic period of time. There were ongoing battles between the Christians and the Muslims through this whole period of time. But the key points in this whole transition certainly was tied to the Saturn-Pluto cycle. And here we have Saturn and Pluto conjoining. Oh, look, in Capricorn again. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Look at this Capricorn lineup, even more than now. Sun, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Saturn, Pluto. And it's Neptune, the planet of religion and of spiritual beliefs. That's the release point on this opposition of Saturn and Pluto to Uranus. Incidentally, we had a Saturn opposition to Uranus and Pluto in the 1960s, and this is a bit of a change of that. But it's a very powerful moment. And it's interesting to consider that although there was constant change on the borders going on through this whole period of time, it actually began with a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and pretty much the downfall was also a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. We look at the plague in Europe, 1347 to 1351, and in 1350, right in the middle of that, there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Now, before we go off into this realm of fear, thinking that every time Saturn and Pluto, get together by conjunction or opposition or square, that terrible things happen, let's just take a quick look at the major events in the abolishment of slavery, because it was in 1833, within a year of the Saturn-Pluto opposition of 1834, that slavery was abolished in the British Empire. Now, this means from one end of the British Empire to the other, it became illegal to buy and sell humans. 1834, at this particular opposition. By the way, this opposition was also the time of Spain getting its butt kicked. This seems to be a theme of Saturn-Pluto events, as Spain kind of being in the mix. But 1834 was when Simon Bolivar basically defeated the Spaniards in South America, and a whole host of a whole host of countries were created, including Bolivia and Ecuador and Colombia and so on. But this was the Saturn-Pluto opposition of 1834. And again, even though it was maybe a difficult time for the Spaniards, it was freedom from colonial domination for the South Americans. And we'll come back to that theme of colonial domination in a few minutes. But here's the crazy thing. And the crazy thing is, at the following Saturn-Pluto opposition, 1834, Saturn-Pluto opposed from Libra to Aries. At the following opposition in 1866, after the Civil War, the U.S. passed the amendment that freed slaves in the United States, and that was in 1865, within a year of that Saturn-Pluto opposition. And if we think that this diachronic connection over time is insignificant, well, you ain't seen nothing yet. But just putting a period on this sentence, we then jump to the fact that in 1965, there was a Saturn-Pluto opposition with Uranus right there in the mix. And the United States, 100 years later, passes the Civil Rights Act. And, and of course, the whole issue of racial equality is, back in front of us here in the United States again. Not that it ever really went away, but as we approach this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, it seems to be getting uglier once again, and we will see what comes of it. But can you see how these events seem to jump from point to point to point over time? Another event was the World War. No one ever thought there would be a second one, so it wasn't called World War I, it was called the World War. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Cancer was within weeks of the shots that kicked the war off in Serbia, the assassination of Duke Ferdinand. And I went back and looked at microwave of newspapers during that period of time. And for months, every week, some nation that we never heard of was declaring war on another nation that we never heard of. And because all these little principalities and dukedoms were all basically pulled into this war that basically redrew the maps, certainly, of Europe. But as we look at this particular sequence here, this conjunction in 1914, at the following opposition in 1931, we have the rise of mass fascism. We have Hitler coming to power. We have Mussolini. We have Stalin. We have the Japanese invasion of China. I mean, this stuff is really heating up again. And although World War II does not fall on a Saturn-Pluto conjunction or opposition, it does fall on the Saturn-Pluto square. Now, for our purposes, we're not looking at that, but certainly Saturn and Pluto were still involved. But it's this beginning, the seeds of what became World War II are planted at this opposition here in 1931. At the following conjunction, after World War II, we had a conjunction on August 10th, 1947. This happens within 1 week. This happens within 1 week of India being granted independence from the British Commonwealth and the partition of Pakistan. This occurred within 1 week of that 1947 conjunction. Incidentally, within the 1 year frame of it, we had the United Nations formed in 1946, and we had, in this period of time, the Israeli-Palestine issue was up big time, as it was in 1931 at the previous event. That was when England declared martial law. This is the opening scenes of the book in the movie Exodus. The Brits didn't know what to do. This is another whole thread. But this is martial law being declared in Palestine. And here, within a year of this, we have Palestine disappearing in 1948 and Israel being put on the map. But this is all tied to the 1947 Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And then at the following opposition, we have the middle of the 60s. And of course, here we also have the Uranus-Pluto, which makes this way more important than just the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was basically a war of my generation of coming of age. Friends of mine from high school and college went off to this war and never came back, and no one ever told them why we were there. That's another whole story. But the fact of the matter is that, again, we have this readjustment of boundaries of the Saturn opposing Pluto during this particular time. Then we go to the next one, which is the conjunction in 1982. And we might think, no big deal, but there were a couple of events there. And one of them obviously was on the continuing thread of the border set between different religious beliefs, whether it's the Muslims and Christians, the Christians and Jews, or the Christians and the Jews and Muslims. Here we have the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And I don't know if I have slides on this later, but this history of Zionism and Israel is very interesting, because it was in 1898 at a Saturn Pluto opposition that the World Zionist Organization was founded. And then at the conjunction in 1914, while World War I was going on, Lawrence of Arabia was basically conscribing the Arabs to come in on the side of the Allies with the promise that they would protect them from Turkish rule forever. And then at 1931, at the opposition, England is freaking out, because how do they protect the sovereign state of Palestine when in fact the World Zionist Organization had reached such a height, and they also had such a loyalty to that, their conflict of interest became untenable. And then in the 1965, the energy between the Israel and the Arab states was heightened. That's around the time of the Six-Day War. And then the 1982, where Israel actually invades and bombs Lebanon. This also, in 1982, was the only time in the 20th century that there was a war between a colonial power and a country in the Western Hemisphere. And although it wasn't necessarily a big war on many people's maps, the fact is that the United Kingdom was at war, declared war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands. And so that was also at this particular conjunction. Now, I want to just talk a moment about synchronicity and diachronicity, even though we already mentioned it. It's just that we often get so tied up in the fascination of things that happen at the same moment in time, we forget that there is a meaningful connection between things that happen over the course of time. It's why you can look at a client's chart and follow through, well, let's say that Saturn conjunction to their moon that we talked about earlier, and track it back to their birth. And every time Saturn conjuncts or squares or opposes, or squares or conjuncts or squares or opposes or squares in that rhythm to their natal moon, something happens that's not separate, but it's all part of a single thread of causal relationships. If you've never done this in your own life, it's a really interesting thing to do, to go, oh my God, as Edna St. Vincent Millay, the American poet, said, life is not one thing after another, it's the same damn thing over and over again. So with diachronicity or diachronic events, we begin to look at diachronic threads. And I'll just give you an example here of a few of them. For example, in 226 AD, Zoroastrianism was declared the state religion in Persia. In 315, and these years are all years of Saturn Pluto events. And again, I say events, I don't care if they're conjunctions or oppositions, they're just events. In 315, Emperor Constantine recognized Christianity in Constantinople. Constantine named Constantinople for Constantine. In 362, Emperor Julian basically banned Christianity. And then in 597, all of these are Saturn Pluto years. St. Augustine arrived in England to convert the English from their old pagan traditions into Christianity, into Catholicism. So there is a thread that somehow keeps popping up again and again and again. Give you another thread. In 379, this tribe appears in history for the first time. I've scoured history books, and the first time I can find the mention of the word Visigoths, which was a tribe, you know, of the Goths. It was like France, Germany, in that area, was right around the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in 379. One cycle later, in 411, was when the Visigoths burned and pillaged Rome, within a year of that. So we have this kind of bumping of this of an event that occurs at one point on this cycle, and then at the next point it reappears, and it's kind of crazy the way it does that. We can go back to the Mecca being declared the state of Islam, you know, by Muhammad in 629, the Moorish invasion of Spain, the Christians reconquering Spain. We talked about that earlier, but that's another diachronic thread. We can look at threads like the Crusades. The first Crusade began in 1095. The Saturn-Pluto opposition was in 1098. But the Christians retook Jerusalem from the Muslims. Again, we have this religious conflict setting new boundaries. And for the first time in 1,000 years, Jerusalem became Christian. It didn't last long. By the way, at the conjunction a couple hundred years later, in 1212, there was the Children's Crusade. And during this crusade, 50,000 children who were marched off to recapture the Holy Land in a religious fervor basically were either killed or captured. I mean, it's nuts, the size of these events. Here's an interesting little one, and that is in 1518, Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses, which basically were all the reasons why Rome did not represent the true religion. And so that's considered to be the origin of the Protestant Reformation, was at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1518. At the Saturn-Pluto opposition in 1534, that's when England separated from the Roman Church and declared the Anglican Church. So we have, again, a similar thing that occurs at different points on the same event. Here's another thread, and in 1552 at the conjunction, there was the first planetary tables based upon Copernican theory. This was the first improvement in the basic tool that we astrologers use in 300 years. And so this was a way of revisioning what the universe looked like. And incidentally, although it doesn't fall directly into this conjunction opposition thread that we're looking at, Copernicus himself was born with the Saturn-Pluto square and died with the first copy of his book, The Revolution of the Spheres, on his deathbed at a Saturn-Pluto square. But what's interesting here is that the following conjunction after these planetary tables were printed, Giordano Bruno publicly defended Copernican theory in his book called The Divine Ashes. In fact, Bruno went on to travel around Europe, and he was farsighted enough to realize and taught that our sun was one of many stars, and all these stars were suns, and therefore they all probably had planets and going around them with intelligent life, and therefore Jesus was the savior here on planet Earth. But what about all the other places? Well, this did not go over well in Rome. And at the next opposition in 1599, Giordano Bruno made his place in history by becoming the last person to be burned at the stake in Rome. And you can go to the spot where he was burned at the stake for his proclamation that the sun was the center rather than the earth being the center. Again, a series of events that are tied to this cycle. Continuing that same thread, we have William Herschel publishing on the construction of the heavens, which actually was the first book that made us realize that our little solar system going around the sun in our little corner of the universe was really just one little system, and that we were part of the actual galaxy we now refer to as the Milky Way galaxy, which we now know is one of millions and millions and millions of other galaxies. All right. We kind of touched on some points on this, but in 1883 at the conjunction, Great Britain occupies Egypt to protect the Suez Canal. And during that same time, the European nations met and they divide up Africa into what we now know as a 20th century colonial Africa. At the opposition in 1898, as I mentioned, the World Zionist Organization was established. In 1914, although World War I was the big event, it was Lawrence of Arabia that basically tied the West into protecting the Arab countries. In 1931, there was unrest in Palestine. We go on to 1947, when the UN was founded, and when Israel was established. And interestingly enough, the UN being founded and the World Zionist Organization being founded were both on, okay, we're repeating these. Let me just go on here. There we go. That takes us, sorry for that. That takes us to 1965. We talked about that. And then the Israeli invasion. And that brings us to the World Trade Tower bombing and sets the stage for the animosity that is occurring, I'd say in this country, but it's really around the world, but it's certainly at a height in this country with the fervor that's being fed into the hate between different religious belief systems, different nationalities, and right now in particular, about those who are either from Christian countries, states, versus those from Muslim states or countries. And this is a very, deeply rooted piece. One other thread that I really, to me, is one of the most fascinating ones is that in 1898, Gandhi spent most of the year in jail because he was in South Africa practicing law. He was an attorney, and he basically was leading protests to get Indian Indians recognized in South Africa as citizens. And so 1898, Gandhi spends most of his time in jail, and he successfully leads a movement that eventually gets Indians recognized in South Africa. At the following opposition in 1931, which was, of course, also the rise of Hitler and the fascism and all of that, once again, Gandhi spends much of the year in jail, but now in India. This is the famous Salt March, because the Indians were required by the Brits to buy salt on the market and pay tax on it to England. And Gandhi led a march to the ocean where people, as an act of protest, boiled the seawater and made their own salt, and he was jailed. In 1947, as I mentioned before, within a few days of the exact Saturn-Pluto conjunction in August of 1947, India and Pakistan were granted independence and partitioned. Now, if you're like me, and you may not be, I remember being taught in grade school about how amazing peaceful resistance was, passive resistance, and how peaceful resistance basically accomplished this great event of, without a war being fought, of India being acknowledged, of the power of Great Britain bowing in to the Indians and granting independence. However, what they forgot to teach me, at least, was that was the good news. They forgot to teach us that during that same period of time, as a result of this independence and the partition of India and Pakistan, upwards to 500,000 people were killed, 500,000 people, in border wars, fights between the Muslims and the Hindus over who gets to control the richness of the Kashmir Valley of Kashmir. And so it wasn't just a happy day where we're free. It wasn't just like, oh my God, the United Nations has been established and now the problem in the Mideast has been solved and Israel is now an independent nation. It wasn't just that. That's the positive spin in the sunlight. The shadow spin behind it was the other half of the story that sometimes we forget about. Now, the crazy thing about this thread is that at the following conjunction in 1982, the movie Gandhi comes out, and for those people who were alive then and who experienced that, they know that this movie wasn't just a movie. This was a major cultural event, and yet when you see it as part of this thread of Gandhi's life, it becomes kind of crazy that a movie of that impact and power would come out on that same thread that was so important to Gandhi's entire life. There exists this piece of writing that is attributed to the Hopi elders. Now, there's some question as to where this actually comes from, but the fact is that it's referred to as the Hopi elders' prophecy. And the Hopi are a Southwest tribe of American indigenous peoples who happen to have a particular interest in long-term prophecy. This particular prophecy, which surfaced probably around 8 or 10 years ago, it was actually prior to 2012, but yeah, it was around 8 or 10 years ago, goes like this. You have been telling the people that this is the 11th hour. Now you must go back and tell the people that this is the hour. And there are things to be considered. Where are you living? What are you doing? What are your relationships? Are you in right relation? Where is your water? Know your garden. It is time to speak your truth. Create your community. Be good to each other. And do not look outside yourself for a leader, for the leader. Then he clasped his hands together, smiled, and said, this could be a good time. There is a river flowing now very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid. They will try to hold on to the shore. They will feel that they are torn apart and will suffer greatly. No, the river has its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, keep our eyes open and our heads above water. And I say, see who is in there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment that we do, our spiritual growth and journey comes to a halt. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves, banish the word struggle from your attitude and your vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration. We are the ones we've been waiting for. So this is a time that astrology can be of use as we look forward to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and the potential ramifications, many of which we are seeing unfolding around us in spades already. I mean, I don't want to go into the political scene. Oh, I could. But But the fact of the matter is that there are things going on now that are huge, that are big, and they will continue to build. And what do we do, knowing the astrology that we know, in face of these large events? How do we react? How do we work with this energy? We can't individually change these things that are big out there, but we can do two things. We can think cosmically and we can act locally. What does that mean? Thinking cosmically allows us to put the individual events that we're experiencing, whether they are, whether we're experiencing them on the evening news, whether we're experiencing them in direct relationship with our children's lovers, friends, parents, whether we are actually dealing with these issues personally or globally. The fact of the matter is we can always act locally. It's less about what's happening out there than it is what happens to how we respond. Now, remember, I'm not saying to go into denial. In fact, I'm saying we need to spend more time thinking about these large-scale issues, whether they're these grandiose cycles that are Waltz Time for civilization that created such horrific events, or that co-created such horrific events like World War I, but also created the abolition movement and the suffragette movement. There is a dynamic conflict going on here now of boundaries. We can't just unplug and ignore it, because every voice is needed, but we don't need every voice globally. Often the most important things we can do are in our immediate home family environment. Carl Jung said that world peace will not come by treaties and politicians. World peace will come by the salvation of all the individual minds on the planet. And so this is a little bit of Mahayana Buddhism that says no one gets off until we all get off. No one is free until we're all free. And this Saturn-Pluto conjunction is simply another focus. It's not the end of the road. There is no end of the road. That's what Pluto teaches. It may be the end of your road or the end of my road, but the fact of the matter is that things go on. Metamorphosis is evolutionary and continues to change. So the question we astrologers need to ask is, what can we do to help others to, first of all, get our own shit together, but secondly, to act as guides for people who can't understand what's going on. You know, back to the caterpillar becoming the butterfly, how does the caterpillar know when it's in the cocoon and it's dark and its skin has melted, disintegrated, and caterpillar is basically falling apart at the seams, is dying? How does the caterpillar know to have faith that it's all going to come back together in a way that's even better than it was? We have a problem the caterpillar doesn't have, and that is we have ego. Ego doesn't like the idea of disintegration for reintegration purposes. Ego doesn't want to let go of the hold it has on what it thinks is real. If the caterpillar had an ego like we do, there's no way in hell, and the use of the word hell is intentional, there's no way in hell it would get into the cocoon, because the cocoon is its hell realms. It's the disintegration, it's the end, it's the death of the caterpillar that becomes basically lost in this black, goppy, murky goo that if you open up a cocoon before the butterfly emerges, the caterpillar's dead and the butterfly hasn't been born yet, but there's no point at which the caterpillar actually dies. Something still stays alive. And it's up to us during this powerful change to remain empowered in the post-egoic, the trans-egoic view that it's not about what we individually lose or can gain during this period of time. It's how we can act as anchors for those we love and for ourselves, so we can go through this process so that we as caterpillars have another shot at becoming butterflies. That's my deal. That's the story. This is just a tip of an iceberg. but I hope it gave you a little bit of a flavor of the importance of this particular Saturn-Pluto conjunction coming up. I did not take the time to frame it in a larger scenario that's based upon the fact that we're coming out of a Uranus-Pluto square that has been 7 times between 2012 and 2015, and that this Saturn-Pluto also has Jupiter coming into the mix, kind of as a last Capricornian hurrah before the energy shifts to Aquarius and everything changes and we move into a whole new paradigm again. I think we'd get tired of paradigm shifts. They seem to be shifting so quickly. But anyhow, I'm happy to take feedback. If anyone has any questions in the chat room, I'd be glad to give an answer or a response. I am always reachable via email at rlevine. Oh, here I have the link, rlevine@stariq.com. I appreciate you all joining us today. For those of you who are not Patreon subscribers, I invite you to go to Patreon, that's patreon.com, patreon.com/Rick Levine, and you can learn about the various levels of involvement that you can have in my online teaching and work. And for those of you who are Patreon members here today or watching it on YouTube, thank you for your ongoing support. And I am always available online. And hi, Leanne, nice to see you. I will post the poem on Patreon, and of course, you will have the link to the on YouTube. You will all receive an email. Those in Patreon will receive it through a Patreon email. Those of you here from Astrology Hub will receive a separate email. It may take me a few days to get this edited and posted, but there will be it will be on YouTube. It will not be a published link. However, you have my ongoing and always permission to share my unposted links with friends and family. Just don't put them on social media. And thank you all. Donna, hi, nice to see you. Seattle misses you. Whitney, thanks for your feedback. Jackie, Jackie wrote that she's a little excited and terrified about the upcoming conjunction. And I would just say, oh, thank you, LUD. It's not LUD, it's LUD. Does that stand for something? Your initials, that's what it must be. Melissa, about being excited and terrified, I have to say this, that there is no use and no value putting fear into an upcoming transit, because that's then what manifests. We get to create what happens in the future, not completely, but we get to color it, we get to tint it. And the more we worry, the more fear we have, the more that which manifests is what we resist will persist. Yeah, and as Mystic Wendy just said, we're in the middle of it now, don't be afraid. Well, that's easy to say, because obviously, you know, if you're a child in a cage right now in a concentration camp on the, you know, on the US border, there is a reason to be afraid. I'm not saying that fear doesn't have its place. I'm just saying that we, in the littlest ways of the littlest things that we can do, whether it being stepping out to demonstrate, whether it being writing letters, whether it being calling your congressman, whether it be speaking your truth at home or in relationships, whether it be loving someone who needs it in a way that you might pass by. All these things all add up. It's the little things that create the greater whole. And I'm stepping down off my little pedestal that I just stood up on to rant for a moment. Thank you all for attending. And I look forward to seeing you all here again online. For those of you who are in the Astrology Hub Inner Circle, I will be the Inner Circle guide for the month of October. Looking forward to that. And for those others of you who might be attending either my Brighton Bush workshop the end of this month, or my week-long retreat with Caroline Casey in Bali, or the NCGR conference coming up in Baltimore, I look to meet you in the real world. And if I ever do, please let me know that we originally bumped into each other here in cyberspace. And with that, I'm ending this meeting and saying goodbye and good luck to all of us. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you. Thank you, Jenny, Judy, and all.